Check. Ooh. Good afternoon. Welcome to session 3 of the 2026 Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Forum. Have you all got your copies of the journal? Yeah, there you go. Be sure you read them cover to cover because it's marvelous. Today's session is a paper that was called Hudson's Bay Point Blankets, Notes on Prices and Colors. It was written by Tom Holloway, who was a professor emeritus at University of California, Davis. He's also been a volunteer researcher at Fort Vancouver for a number of years. He's published several papers in the journal. He's a very meticulous researcher, just a fascinating fellow. He knows stuff very well. He can't be here, so he has prepared a presentation for us, and I'm going to read it to you. So what you hear is coming from my mouth, but it's the voice of Tom Holloway. Tom Holloway couldn't be here today, and given the problems of combining video and audio with images at a distance, he has asked us to narrate his comments for this presentation. This illustrated talk is intended to provide context for his article, which involved a deep dive into the Hudson Bay Company archives, now available online. This project started early last year when several members of the Northwest Fur Trade Historians, a group of fur trade enthusiasts and reenactors based in Spokane, Washington, knowing that I've done quite a bit of research in the Hudson's Bay archives, contacted me with a question. Like all good historical reenactors, they wanted their dress and equipment to be as accurate and representative as possible. In the Pacific Northwest, where the Montreal-based Northwest Company and then the London-based Hudson's Bay Company dominated the land-based fur trade, the blankets used by trappers and traded to natives were called point blankets. Their size was marked by small lines sewn into one edge. I'll share more about how the points were related to price later in this talk. Here's a well-known style of point blanket, white with wide bands at each end in green, red, yellow, and indigo blue. The modern HBC like to call them multi-stripe, but these days, many people informally call them candy stripe. Some group members thought candy stripe blankets were a modern innovation dating from after the fur trade. If that were true, they wouldn't be suitable for a reenactment. Others had heard or read or seen images that showed they were popular during the fur trade era. If that's the case, they would be fine to include in a reenactor's kit. I had not seen multi-stripe blankets in historical documents, but I agreed to look into it. Another question that comes up is whether capotes like these, made from candy stripe point blankets, would be suitable for a reenactment. I've seen that the HBC imported thousands of what were called cloth capotes, but not much evidence that trappers and traders made their own by cutting up blankets, no matter what kind. I've included the findings from my research on the original questions in this year's Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, so I won't go over them again here. Suffice it to say that the project turned out to be more complicated and interesting than I thought it would be. But as I reviewed requisitions, inventories, and shipping manifests and found very few mentions of the multi-stripe pattern in the fur trade era, I began to wonder, how did this recent emphasis on candy stripe blankets and coats made from them come about? Blame it on Canada. An internet search brought up this image. It turns out that before 1968, Canada's Winter Olympic teams wore similar coats in 1936, 1960, and 1964. Clearly, fur trade reenactors weren't the only ones enamored with the candy stripe pattern. By the middle of the 20th century, it had become a marker of Canadian national identity. Looking for hints as to how this came about, I decided to go through HBC's magazine, The Beaver, which began in 1920 as a company newsletter, but soon began publishing general interest articles. In 1933, The Beaver added the subtitle, A Magazine of the North. And in 2010, it was renamed Canada's History. My foray into the HBC's own media outlet turned out to be as interesting and revealing as the earlier slog through fur trade era documents. When full-page ads featuring coats made from point blankets began to appear in the Beaver, the emphasis was on style rather than history. In 1922, the woman's model was, quote, the coat of the Hudson's Bay fur trader with the addition of those niceties and improvements which makes for good appearance and comfort, end quote. The man's coat was, quote, the smart and correct attire that appeals to common sense, worn by vigorous outdoorsmen who stay young, close quote. In 1936, candy striped coats showed up, and the ad copy gushed, quote, what a picture you'll make in this gorgeous new Hudson Bay type Mackinaw, close quote. For anyone who might wonder, $8.95 in 1936 would be about $200 today. Point blankets were also promoted in the early years of the Beaver with quality that spoke for itself and no mention of history, nor the fur trade. Multi-stripe was included in the list of available colors, but not in the illustrations. While women were reminded of what a picture they'd make in a multi-striped jacket, men were told, quote, ask the man who owns a point blanket, and he will tell you you can obtain nothing finer, close quote. A candy stripe blanket appears in front of the skis on the right side, but the emphasis here is on a blanket that will come up to expectations every time. Again, with no mention of history, nor of the fur trade. By 1937, the HBC, through its own magazine, was not above a little self-congratulation, using the self-deprecating Canadian humor. The Arctic hunter here, wrapped in a point blanket capote, was shocked to see the polar bear was wearing the brand, quote, an astonishing response to Hudson Bay point blank advertising, end quote. This painting, which is included in my article, was the cover art for The Beaver in December 1941, and then printed on 100,000 copies of the HBC's souvenir calendar for 1942. By bringing the candy stripe design to the forefront and connecting it to the fur trade era, the image marks a watershed. It depicts a real event that took place in 1846, and while no one in 1941 could have known what the subject was wearing, the director of HBC's calendar department suggested that the artist could use bright costumes for the men that would provide plenty of brilliance. He got what he asked for. Last year, 355 years after it was chartered, the Hudson's Bay Company dissolved. In the dispersal of its art collection, this painting sold for more than $400,000 US. The auction catalog read, quote, in Charles Comfort's dramatic composition, both traders wear capotes, hooded coats made from the company's heavy wool point blankets. The central figure features the iconic HBC stripes, close quote. In his book, The Blanket, co-published by the HBC in 2002, Harold Tichenor placed this image opposite page 1, chapter 1, entitled The Birth of an Icon. Tichenor doesn't completely ignore plain white single bar blankets, but with this image and elsewhere, including the book's cover illustration, shown here at the lower left, and printing tabs with the 4 multi-striped colors on the edge of nearly every page, the candy stripe design is given pride of place. Anyone taking their cue from Tichenor book could easily develop the impression that candy stripe blankets were dominant or typical in the fur trade era, so they would be appropriate for reenactment today. As my article shows, that is not the case. In the second half of the 20th century, the promotion of the multi-stripe design really took off. This ad appeared in the Beaver many times in the 1950s. Point blankets were declared to be the world's most famous blanket, with no hint that there were any patterns other than the candy stripe. I clipped this page from a 2010 retrospective article that once again called this design iconic and the 4 colors traditional. This ad, which was a staple well into the 1960s, declared the candy stripe blanket, carefully posed with native artifacts and antiques, to be the granddaddy of them all. Buried in the text is an explicit connection to the remote past. Quote, "For the history-minded, the Hudson's Bay point blanket is one of the few surviving links with the early fur trade, when identical blankets to these were worth more in trading with Indians than cash in hand." Here's another from the 1960s, again posed with native artifacts, declaring that the blanket you buy now is the same as ever. Quote, "Its standard of quality has remained unaltered over the centuries," end quote. As with the other ads in that era, the images and text leave the impression that the multi-stripe design was the only pattern that ever existed. By the early 1970s, the copywriters of Winnipeg apparently decided that a Canadian version of rugged individualism would sell blankets. The candy stripe is again the only blanket in sight, with a saddle and broad-brimmed hat apparently on the platform of a frontier train station. To one side is a teepee behind some brush and a pair of beaded moccasins. By the late 1970s, this ad had less text and simpler graphics. The 2 centuries was an apparent reference to the 1780 decision by the Hudson's Bay Company to place an order for the point blankets for the first time. But the images again leave the impression that the only point blankets from then to now were candy striped. The fine point at lower right says the available color choices were multi-stripe, scarlet, gold, or sky blue at the Bay and other leading stores. Plain white blankets with 1 bar at each end, which were the most common in the fur trade era by far, were out of sight and out of mind. Saving the best for last, this ad pushed the boundaries of historical accuracy beyond the breaking point. The napping figure in the vaguely early buckled hat, kept warm by a multi-striped blanket, is nestled in a replica of the Nonsuch, which was built to commemorate the HBC's tricentennial in 1970. The replica is depicted under sail in the inset on the left, above another inset with a stack of multi-striped blankets, apparently to represent this ship's cargo. The original Nonsuch was chartered in 1668 to scout out possible locations for a land-based trading post on Hudson Bay, with a view to forming a joint stock venture, which in due course was chartered by King Charles II on May 2nd, 1670, the Company of Adventurers trading into Hudson Bay. This visual message is only surpassed by the text at the top, where we're told that HBC point blankets, all of which were apparently candy stripe, were created when ruggedness was still beautiful, craftsmanship was still an art, drabness was an affront to the eye, and there was plenty of time for every fine detail. By bringing up this material, I don't mean to suggest that the ads in the Beaver magazine by themselves led to today's discussion as to whether candy stripe blankets are acceptable equipment for reenacting the fur trade era. But the modern department store advertising was part of a broader public relations campaign to promote the idea that multi-stripe blankets and the color scheme they embodied were iconic markers of Canadian history and national identity. Other elements in that campaign included candy stripe coats on Canada's Winter Olympic teams and Harold Tichenor's book, The Blanket. Without the public relations push in the 20th century, I doubt that anyone today would be asking whether candy stripe blankets and capotes made from them are appropriate for reenacting the fur trade of the early 1800s. As the documents discussed in my article indicate, in the fur trade era, candy stripe blankets made up a very small fraction, less than 10% of the point blankets traded east of the Rocky Mountains, and almost none west of the Rockies. It follows that if reenactors today wanted their kits to reflect what was typical or representative of the fur trade era, they would not think of using a candy stripe point blanket. And in answer to the subsidiary question, if reenactors of the fur trade want to make coats out of point blankets, they should look something like these. Using blankets that are solid white or creamy off-white with a single band, either bright red or dark blue, near each end. But wait, there's more. While I was digging in the archives, counting blankets, I was lucky to find information that addresses another question that often comes up when discussing point blankets: whether the short lines sewn into one edge only always indicated the size of the blanket, or whether there was a time and place where they indicated the intended price in beaver pelts. For some time now, the conventional wisdom has been that any equivalence of points with price was coincidental and transient. Here are 3 statements to that effect. In 1997, James Hansen wrote in the Museum of the Fur Trade Quarterly that, quote, "The story of the points indicating beaver skins is one of the enduring myths of the fur trade," end quote. In 2002, Harold Tichenor wrote that, quote, "Contrary to popular belief, any equivalence between points and pelts was coincidental," end quote. And the 2004 HBC brochure declared that, quote, "It is often stated that the points represented the number of beaver pelts required to obtain the blanket in fur trade days. That is not so," end quote. The documentary record contradicts those statements. While it's true that the points have always indicated the size of a given blanket, it is also true that for a considerable period of time in the vast region between Hudson Bay and the Rocky Mountains, the intended price of most blankets was explicitly and deliberately equivalent to the points in the edge. Each year, a standard of trade, a list of intended prices for common trade items in beaver pelt equivalents, was issued for the region to which York Factory on the west side of Hudson Bay was the headquarters. I say intended because trade with natives was not sale at fixed prices. The amounts listed in the standard of trade were the starting point in the barter process. Point blankets first showed up in the York Factory Standard of Trade in 1787, shown here at the top. The entry for blankets lists red and green at 1 blanket for 6 beaver pelts. Inserted below that, apparently after the page was drawn up, is, quote, pointed each 0.1, close quote. In other words, for point blankets, the price was intended to be 1 beaver pelt per point. In the following years, as shown here for 1810, blankets in sizes from 1 to 3 points were 1 beaver each point. Standard prices for larger size, of which fewer were traded, were 3.5 point for 4 beaver and 4 point for 6 beaver. There's more on this topic in my article, but the general point is that the conventional wisdom is wrong. For about a quarter of a century, and maybe more if standards of trades can be found for later years, east of the Rocky Mountains, the official intended price of most blankets was 1 point per pelt. So we don't have Tom here to answer questions, but he is willing to take your questions if you want to email him. Here's Tom's email address. And feel free, after you've read the article particularly, don't ignore reading the article. It is fascinating. But Tom is offering to engage your questions and probably provide you an answer that will knock your socks off. Thank you very much.
So we're live streaming this right now, so I'm going to talk a little bit to the live stream audience as well as, and that will be recorded as well as to you guys. But we have a mystery video I want to show you from the past, from the 1997 symposium that was held here in Pinedale. See the state of the art of fur trade research at that time. But I'm going to turn off the live feed because I don't know how to share video and live feed audio on both that and the screen at the same time. So we will, for those who are online, we will post the video later on our YouTube channel. So give me just a minute to turn on that video.